Hi everyone, I'm Sabrina, head of coaching here at Mochary Method. So today I'm bringing you another wonderful interview with one of my clients, Mattan, and this conversation is so insightful. You'll learn a lot about what it's like to be an entrepreneur, what it's like to feel fearful about letting go and hiring new leaders on your team, what it's like to create a wonderful personal habit system and support system so that you can be the best version of you. And last but not least, the thorough process of what it takes to do a graceful and respectful RIF. Mattan is an impressive individual. He's an award-winning faculty member at Columbia Business School. He's an author, and he's a two-time YC founder. He is now the co-founder and president of Ophelia. But what Ophelia does, and he'll tell you a little bit more about it, they offer online treatment for opiate addiction. And he's also the Innovation Fellow at the Lang Center for Entrepreneurship, and he was one of Forbes 30 Under 30 in the education category. So please enjoy this interview. I hope you learn as much as I did. Where I'd love to start is to hear a little bit about what lights you up right now.
I mean, my mind immediately goes towards the professional, but something I'm really excited about is to see a lot of our strategies and things that we've working so hard for play out over the next 6 to 12 months. It's like we're at this inflection point in our business where I really just believe more than ever that we're on the right strategy and we have the right plan in place, and it's going to take longer than it used to. Like in the early stages of the business, it was like you could turn around a new idea or campaign in like a week. But that gets more challenging as you get bigger. But we now have some really amazing people in place, and we've got so many irons in the fire, and I'm actually just really excited to see them actually to start to see the results, because these are complicated things. So to start seeing the hard work paying off, and it's starting to get there already. I'm starting to see early signs. So that's what's really lighting me up, as well as I mentioned to you before, the possibility of reinventing my role for the fourth or fifth time in the last few years. But this is the first major shift where I've kind of gotten most of the big things off of my plate, and now I actually get to focus on I could kind of create the ideal role for myself, and I get to focus on what's the most important, and what's the longer term strategic thing for Ophelia that I could be doing, as opposed to what has the most urgent need right now, or what's the biggest fire to be fixed.
This is all sounding really exciting because also from what I've known about you, there's been a lot of building, a lot of changing, and the company is finally now in a place where I'm hearing a lot of clarity, a lot of alignment, a lot of confidence, for kind of a harvest. And it's already starting to show the fruition. And then you said something, your role shifted 4 to 5 times just in the last year. And it's finally going from reactive to now being proactive to be able to build that from scratch. Why is that? What happened in the past year?
I took all the advice, well, actually over the last 3 years since starting Ophelia, of keep hiring yourself out of a job. Do something, but if you're not the best person to do it in the long run, then find better people and find people who can be smarter than you around you. So, when I first started, I was running all of the marketing and all of the product and tech and engineering, and also just operations generally for the business. And, it started to get to the point where okay, my focus is not well spent managing our Facebook, ads. So we hired a director of growth who managed, direct response and paid advertising. And then pretty soon after brought in a VP of marketing. And then the same on the tech side, I started building out the engineering team, brought in a director of engineering, promoted one of our engineers into a product manager, and he became director of product. And then more recently brought in a CTO. So that was the first C-level executive that we brought in outside of me and my co-founder. And that was a big level up. It was scary as well to first of all, to like convince ourselves that we could justify and we could get someone with his level of pedigree, but also that we could justify, the cost, and that we were, far enough along where it made sense. But he has just like leveled up the company so much in really surprising ways, and that's just shown me time and time again, like how, even if it's scary, how like incredibly valuable it is for the business and for myself to bring in these people. And so then the most recent change was, after sort of letting go of those areas of the business, I was kind of left with operations. And then we recently brought on a COO. This is a search that we started like a year ago, took, 7 or 8 months to find the candidate we really liked, took 2 to 3 months for him to actually start. And then he started in December. And so I sort of let go of that last remaining part of what my responsibilities were when we started the business. And when we started the business, there were just a lot of areas of the business that someone needed to do it. So it's like, well, if no one's going to do, customer support, then it's not going to happen. So someone has to step in, and between me and Zach, my co-founder, we just divided up the responsibilities. So this is the first time I've like gotten off of my plate all of those initial set of responsibilities, which means now getting to actually be a little bit more proactive about like what's important for Ophelia for the future. What do the next 2 to 3 years look like? What are some of the more strategic initiatives and priorities and growth focused things that we could be doing that are not just like reacting to the problems that are happening on a day-to-day basis? Because I think that's how some of those functional areas can be. Operations, there's always something on fire, so you have to go and fix that area. And so that sort of necessitates the shift, and it's what's led to my like thinking about, okay, what excites me and what do I want to be working on for the next few years, and what's the most valuable area of the business, and what's the overlap there. I'm
Yeah.
still I'm still fleshing that out, so I don't have any. I have ideas, but I don't have like a total answer yet.
And you say it so effortlessly. You basically just gave like 10 different stages of the business, but I know that for anyone who's been through that, it's not easy. And you
Yeah.
talked a little bit about the fear. You said it was fearful, but I'm glad that I did it. What was scariest about letting go continuously and giving up something that you were doing?
There's that article that I often cite and that we kind of seeded on our leadership team, the letting go of your Legos article, which you may have been the person who showed it to me in the first place, but like the idea that as a startup you constantly have to be letting go of your Legos, which as a kid is scary because it's like it's mine, and especially when you work so hard on some area of the business where maybe you're an expert there to begin with, but maybe you're not, and it took you a real long time to go through struggling and then building up something, and then I was proud of what I'd built in many of these areas in the business. So to then let go of that to someone else where I had no certainty that they would actually like uphold the thing that I had built or do it a certain way. There's that tendency often leads to like micromanaging or trying to hold on to something too much. And both of those are kind of, I think, the same thing in a way, right? Sometimes people don't let other people in and they want to hold on to something because they feel like it's just gonna be too hard to explain it to someone else and they won't do it as well. And that may be true, right? Maybe I am the best, whatever, the best marketer, the best operations person. I don't believe those things, but somewhere out there, there's maybe a CEO who's like really good at a particular thing. And any person they hire, they're like, that person won't do it as well as I will. But even if that's true, I can't do all of the things well, right? Like once I don't get the luxury to just focus on that one thing, there's so many different aspects that I have to look at. And so the only way for me to be able to like operate at the level that I should be operating at as, a co-founder is to have specialists focused on each of these areas. I also think, people can and will surprise you. Really talented people will surprise you in terms of finding different and creative ways to solve problems that I never would have thought of. And that's part of what I want. So when they say like try to surround yourself with people who are smarter than you, like that's the reason, because I'm not going to have the best solution to all the problems. But to that point, like imagine being in a room of people that are all smarter than you. That's like crazy intimidating. it's very easy to then develop like imposter syndrome. And I think that's really especially prevalent among co-founders. It's like, well, if all of these people in the room are smarter than me at all the things, then what value am I providing here for this business? What, how do I prove myself? And I think it's also, I've gotten stuck in that loop, and still it's something I'm trying to work through of like, how do I prove both to others and to myself that I am valuable and that I'm working on the thing that's the most important. And it's easy to fall into the temptation of doing things that are easy to show, like externally, this is valuable, like that daily stand-up temptation to just like this, make up a bunch of stuff you're doing today so that other people don't, wonder, oh, what is this person actually doing? But like, that's not actually what it's about. And that doesn't matter so much. Like at the end of the day, it's actually about what matters most for the business. And it's challenging at such a high level. You don't often have really concrete things to show for it. Sometimes the things that I've done that are the most impactful for the business, it's hard to even know at the time. They're not concrete. They don't check boxes. It's hard to put like in a to-do list. It's like very nebulous and ambiguous. But I think it's essential to get into that way of thinking at some point.
What's amazing about what you're saying is you have such a grounded view of, you can articulate what's scary and what imposter syndrome is and what you get stuck, and you can acknowledge that you're still working through it while you've kind of started to show, here are some ways that what things that I have done to have overcome some of it. So can you be a little bit more specific in the past? What have you done to get you unstuck?
I think the first thing I'll speak to is just acknowledging the vulnerability of being in a position or a situation like that. Like just recognizing we all have areas that we're kind of self-conscious about, or feel sensitive. And I think sometimes the loneliness of that is actually maybe worse than the actual like feeling you're feeling, like not being able to share it. So something that I've actually started practicing is even just like asking people like for reassurance, right? And that doesn't have to be everyone at the company, but hopefully you have a relationship with your co-founder or other people around you to say like, hey, in these moments where I'm feeling a little down, like, can you just tell me I'm doing a good job? It goes a surprisingly long way. As weird as it seems, I practice this in relationship now too, in my personal life. It's like, hey, can you just remind me that you love me, or remind me why, I'm special to you, or things like that, right? So asking for the support there. I think maybe on the more tactical side, like doing this and letting go of things in small ways, which then builds the confidence to do it in bigger and bigger ways. So, practicing letting go of a project, letting people surprise you, that also allows you to build up confidence in them over time. Allowing yourself to be surprised. I think sometimes it takes like one or two times where you're like, wow, this person's really doing a great job. To then be like, okay, yeah, I feel confident I can give them more and more things. And in a similar vein, just like the more you dive into the deep end of uncertainty and realize that everything's okay on the other side of that, the more confident you feel to, do that in bigger and bigger ways. And I think entrepreneurs tend to have some bit of that, right? Because they took that initial leap. I remember the first time I like quit my job to start a different company. It was like terrifying. But on the other side of that, I actually realized like, okay, like it wasn't so bad. I learned a lot. I took certain risks, but the risks are actually less than what most people think. And it made it easier to then, try the next thing and the next thing and the one after that. Like eventually I just built confidence in myself as like an entrepreneur to be able to land on my feet. Yeah, but honestly, I will say that the area of reinvention is one of the hardest parts of like being a founder for me, because it's this constant cycle that even I get stuck in, which is like, I'm really bad at something and I don't realize I'm really bad at it. So I'm kind of frustrated and flailing and feel like everything is bad. And it takes a while before I even become like aware and conscious of like, oh, the reason I'm struggling is because I'm lacking this skill, or this is an area that's pushing my growth edge. And it might take weeks or months or something before I even realize and I'm able to articulate that. And that's this moment that I think of as like, it can be both really exciting because I'm like, oh, now I actually have a thing I can learn about. Like there are books on this, there are people I can talk to who can help me level up here. But then often I inevitably feel really stupid. I started reading about these things and I go, damn it, I'm like such an idiot. I've been doing it this way, the wrong way for so long. Like, obviously it's hard. I've learned to try to reframe that as learning, right?
Mm,
When I feel stupid about myself, it means I've learned something that I didn't know before, and that's essential. So, an essential part of continuing to level up and learn is also feeling kind of dumb the whole
mm,
time. So, if I can just normalize that, that's a good thing, which also means the same thing about like reinventing myself, like going through that frustration and lack of clarity, and I don't know what's going on and I feel bad is essential to then identifying an area that I need to improve on, learning it, getting better, and then in that final stage, it's tough because it's like, well, now I've gotten through to the other side. I'm doing something and I'm good at it, but now how can I, convince myself to let go of it so that I can focus on the next area that I'm inevitably going to be really shitty at, and that cycle repeats itself. Um, so that's a hard that's a hard cycle to go through. But I don't know, maybe I'm just like stuck in it, and I think a lot of founders are probably like stuck there.
on one hand, it seems like you're stuck. On the other hand, it seems like this is the path that you're choosing, right? And it's just
Yeah.
somehow a repeating cycle. And what you are sharing now is now you know all of the stages of the cycle.
Yeah. Well, I think it's two ways of seeing the same thing. I
Yeah.
remember who it was Noah Kagan actually, who I was having a conversation with years ago, and he was talking to Andrew Chen, and basically Andrew had said something to him like, "You are a really really shitty employee." I think this was about him being early at Facebook and he got fired or something. It's like, "You are a shitty employee. Great. Now you know that. Go start something." Right? Because like it's almost, I think an entrepreneur is kind of someone who's just like really bad at being an employee, maybe. Not always, but often. And I think that's sometimes the drive that will lead me to continuing to find green space in new areas because like by the time I found an area, gotten really good at it, built a structure, I started to get really bored of the structure and the TDM of it. So I'm
Mhm,
like, it's driving me crazy. I need to break out of it.
mhm.
And so I think that's another good impetus to like hire someone else to
Yeah.
continue to refine it and do it a little bit better. Because if I'm doing the same thing for too long, I will just go crazy. So it's a choice, but it's also in a way a drive and an aversion to
Right.
the other thing.
It's both a drive and an aversion. And I think what you've alluded
Yeah.
to is um it's going to be hard, but there's also such unique excitement and almost like a big hit when you do learn something, when you do get good at something. But for
Yeah.
the parts that are hard, I hear a lot of self-respect going into what do I need, and a lot of courage going into asking for what I need, whether that be validation, reassurance, or support, or whatever that is. And I think exactly like you said, I believe we suffer most because we suffer alone. If we air
Yeah.
out our suffering, that tends to feel a little bit better, right? And
Yeah.
then you talked about so much about how do I get conscious about something that I'm not good at, and how do
Yeah.
I normalize and reframe it as part of the normal process. And we know that you can train your mind to look at something that's hard to give you that dopamine hit. So you
Yeah.
are showing us how you've rewired your brain in a way to be on this path that gives you a lot of meaning and motivation, even though it will always be hard, and you know it'll be hard and it'll still be hard.
Totally. Yeah. I think to your first point, like we are relational, a relational species. And that reminded me of like tactically, two things that have made it easier for me. First is I'm just a big fan of structure and routines. And I think that as like stress level and uncertainty in some areas of my life have ramped up, I need more and more structure in other areas of my life. So for me, it's been essential that like I meditate for 30 minutes every morning and I drink my cup of tea at the same time and I stretch for 20 minutes and I work out 3 times a week. Like that structure is essential because I realize if I don't do that, then I start to go crazy by the end of the day with everything else that's going on. And I know that that's like I remember being on the other side of the table, kind of hearing that as advice from people, and it's like so frustrating because I tried for years to try to meditate, and it never stuck. But I was like, well, I heard this thing is good for you, but it's like it just doesn't work for me. And I did what really did it actually was daily journaling. I tried to meditate and it didn't work, even though I was like, I would be okay at meditating at night sometimes because it helped me fall asleep better. So that's how I first would like experiment with it. But then I started doing the daily, like the morning pages practice in the morning, and that's what stuck. And once that stuck, I was able to do like morning pages and then 5 minutes of meditation afterwards. And I was like this whole just learning process of like, well, how is it going to work for me? Like, regardless of how someone else says I should do it. And sometimes I wasn't sitting and meditating, like I had a rough morning. So I would do like a walking meditation, just set like a 5 minute timer, or like, do the headspace, like walking meditations or on the subway or whatever. And if I didn't do that, I would set a timer on my phone for an hour. And then I kept snoozing it for another hour until I finally did it. So that was like to get to the routine down. Um, but I also, I mean, in terms of structure, like with other people, I have a therapist. I've worked with executive coaches. Um, I have a weekly men's group. It's the same five of us that meet once a week, and we chat through what's going on in our lives and how we're feeling. Um, I have advisors. I have friends that I get on the phone with constantly, and it's really helpful to have those systems because it feels like an advisory board that I've created of all of these people who are coming at problems in my life from different angles. And it's usually in one of those groups that I uncover a nugget and I'm like, oh, I didn't realize that here's a thing I was feeling, or here's a problem. They may help me think about it in a different way, or I might take something from one space into another space. I bring up something in men's group, which I can then explore in therapy or in executive coaching or in a different forum. And it's especially in those areas where, it's a lot easier to get the reflection and the support of people being like, oh, it just sounds like you're struggling in this area. Here's a great book to read, or here's a resource or someone you should talk to about that.
That's wonderful. I'm so glad that you spoke to it in such detail. And sometimes we think if you're a CEO, if you're a co-founder, you have to put everything on your shoulders. You know what? You need a lot of support. You need your army, and you have your system of habits that you've tuned up, it sounds like, through years to make it feel like you, that supports you in a unique way, and you know that it's meaningful for you, and you have different outlets of friends and advisors and people that you can tap into, and that's what makes you you, and that's what makes you able to grow and evolve at the speed that you're able to right now, and that's wonderful.
Yep.
That makes me want to ask you about your life story, because I've for sure heard about bits and pieces, but what is like your life story in 2 minutes?
2 minute life story, sort of starting closer to the beginning. I'm the kid of immigrants. Technically, I'm an immigrant, but I was born in Tel Aviv and moved to the U.S. when I was pretty young. So I spent most of my childhood in New Jersey. But my dad's Israeli, my mom is German. It always made me feel a little bit out of place. I think that's an important aspect that sort of defines some of my like habits and approaches to things. They're both also quite entrepreneurial. I think immigrants tend to be more entrepreneurial, sometimes out of necessity. And so I always got to see them trying very different non-traditional things in different ways, not like the tech startup entrepreneur, but like small business. My dad was a scientist who ended up, um, like investing in real estate, and so end up, building a little real estate business. And my mom, was became a massage therapist, and then did computer training, and got into yoga teaching and meditation, and had a series of like meditation courses for kids, like so many random things. And that always made it easier for me to be like, oh, they're not expecting me to like go work in investment banking or become a doctor or whatever. Like they are cool with whatever I do. So I think I feel very lucky that I got that kind of, support. But at the same time, I always had a bit of a chip on my shoulder because I didn't feel like I fit in with anyone around me. And so I wanted to prove to them that I was like, I could do it, or I was valuable. And I went and studied finance, but I kind of hated it. So I also then got into philosophy, and always being a little different, and it's like loved spending time thinking about stuff. And um, I I did start like a lot of businesses as a kid. In middle school, I used to buy candy at like Costco, and bring it in to school and sell it out of like a plastic bag during lunch. I like made, a dollar for like a Snickers bar that I bought for 25 cents, you know. And eventually the school called me into the vice principal's office and made me stop because they found out what I was doing. But I also like I would illegally rip software and onto CDs, like, video games, StarCraft, Roller Coaster Tycoon, like those sort of things, and sell that to kids in school. And at one point, I was doing screen printing of T-shirts, like so many random things. Um, and so then fast forward, I think it was quite natural that like even in my first job out of college, I started to get a lot of ideas for businesses I wanted to start. And um, you know, barely stayed in that first job for less than 2 years before I quit and decided to like try to do something on my own. And didn't have didn't have any of like the technical experience to do it. Didn't have a technical co-founder either. But to the point of like proving to people I could do this, decided I would teach myself how to code.
Mm.
Um, and I had read I'd read the 4 Hour Work Week and 4 Hour Body from Tim Ferriss, and his whole premise is like accelerated learning. Like you can do things way faster than most people think you can if you find the right approach. So I was like, well, what if I can teach myself how to code in a month, instead of 4 years, like with a CS degree. So I gave that a shot. I wanted to prove to people I could. It was like a really fascinating experience, and I learned a lot doing it, and I got really excited and into it. And that ended up actually, weirdly enough, becoming the first startup that I started, was teaching other people how to code, which was never the intention. So I think a lot of it also was like starting out in one path, but never being so blinders on that I'm ignoring the opportunities that are nearby. Um, and so as soon as it became clear that like that, because I started teaching classes, called How to Teach Yourself How to Code, at a co-working space that I was working out of in New York City called General Assembly. And I was only doing that because I did a blog post that got a lot of readers, so they asked me to do it, and I realized I could like pay for rent while I was doing the other startup idea. But then that was what actually started to really build traction. So I was like, all right, let me drop what I'm doing here and like try to go all in on this one. And I think in a way my entire career has been like a series of
Mm.
progressions like that.
Listen,
That's the
yeah,
4-minute version, maybe twice as long
that's
as you asked.
all good, all good. That's fascinating. Listening to the opportunities and investing in them, and the at least the reflection that I'm getting here is when you choose that entrepreneurial path, you really start a business with all of your life history and your upbringing and your habits and all that, right? Like I didn't even know meditation. You have a history of meditation through your mom, so it's
Yeah,
really we're bringing all of ourselves into what we're building, and sometimes I think as leaders we think that the only thing we can use is our mind, our logical mind, but that's often not the case. We're playing with humans, emotions, relationships, like you said, and all of the things that
totally.
we're inputting to craft the life that we have to be able to run something. And you just exemplified that with your life story.
Yeah, and I think sometimes it's overwhelming to start out. Like, I think a lot of those things only make sense in retrospect, looking backwards. I think it's a Steve Jobs quote that like you can't tell a story looking forwards. You have to look back and connect the dots and then, turn it into a story. Um, and so it makes sense, but in the moment, I think a lot of people get overwhelmed with advice like find out what you really are passionate about and do that, and then they're like, well, what am I passionate about? How do I figure out what I'm the best at or whatever? It's like I don't think you can know in any way. You can't sit in a room and figure that out. I think it's a lot about experimentation and then like paying attention to how it feels and just continuing to follow that. So whatever that is for me, like, for whatever reason, continuing to challenge myself and learn a new thing,
Mhm.
and then demonstrate like mastery of that always made me feel great. And then teaching in front of a group of people was like the pinnacle of excitement for me. So I kind of just like kept doing that thing. And I learned a lot over time about what worked for me and what didn't.
So you've dedicated yourself to a process instead of just a mere destination. But I
Yeah.
still want to ask a little bit about that. And I understand that you said it's hard to look at the story when you're in it, but what do you think? What is your hypothesis of your future story?
I think still this constant state of self-exploration. I like to be on the edge. I really like to challenge myself and learn new things. And so my future story is kind of like continuing to elevate that further and further. I think like leveraging my skills and my abilities. I think that's one reason why startups always made sense. And learning how to code was like a clear example of like, well, okay, now that I've learned how to code, I can either build the next whatever, or I can teach other people how to build the next whatever. And then I might, you know, 100 startups, 1,000 startups come out of this thing. So I'm able to leverage myself and have a greater impact. Um,
Mm.
and it's cool because the other day I was sitting in a Sweet Green, like literally 2 days ago, and this guy was like, "Are you Mattan? I took your 1 month Rails class 10 years ago when I was in high school, and it changed my life. And now I'm like a product manager at this company, and he's like,
No
I just want to say thank you so much." And that was just like, whoa, that blew me away. I had no idea the kind of dividends that would pay off from these things. I think early on somehow got this rule in my mind that like if I can invest more energy outwards than I am inwards, that will eventually just start snowballing and coming back to me. So the return on my time is so much greater um,
way.
externally if it's done to help other people. And as a result, like I met my co-founder at Ophelia because he took one of my classes that I was teaching at General Assembly 12 years ago. I had no idea that that would happen like 10 years later. Um, it's just stuff that like at the time was like, okay, this feels directionally correct, but it's hard to measure the immediate ROI on it.
Wow.
But following that sort of like leveraging of myself, I mean, one thing that I would love to do moving forward is get to both demonstrate like additional expertise and mastery. So like I wrote a book a little while ago, like a few years ago, on Python for MBA students. For some reason, I would love to like get called into Congress as like an expert, on some field, right, and get to educate them. Richard Feynman is a big idol of mine, and I remember seeing video of him like explaining the Challenger explosion in front of Congress, and it just blew me away.
Mm.
Um, and so like increasing levels of getting to explain to people who, you know, they themselves are highly leveraged already, so it has like a bigger ripple impact. Um, and also working with, advising and helping other startup founders. So now
Mm.
that I've learned so much about healthcare, which is never something I expected to go into, but have
Mm.
gotten increasingly fascinated by,
Mm.
I feel like there's a lot of opportunity to help other people in the space, help them understand all
Mm.
these things I've learned about, like, yeah, how do you work with health insurance companies? How do you navigate, all these complex regulations and just the healthcare industry and all, I wish that there was someone who could have like sat me down and explained it to me, but now I could do that for other people. And
Mm.
so I would love to like sit on the boards of companies, 10 years from now, if I was on the boards of 5 or 10 companies, that's another way to sort of leverage yourself up, right? Rather than managing one company, you're managing multiple companies, but through quarterly check-ins, right? And it's a little bit of nudging and guidance and very high level strategy, but being able to have a bigger impact through that. So one of my visions.
Yeah, I mean, there's a consistent theme of challenging yourself, learning, mastery, like you said, teaching and giving. And there's a big component of helping others ever since the beginning. So I guess how did you stumble upon the idea of Ophelia?
Ophelia came about because I unfortunately lost a close friend in college to an opioid overdose. And for those people who aren't aware, what we do at Ophelia is we treat opioid addiction, and we do it through telemedicine and software that brings doctors and clinical professionals to people. It's a very complicated model, behind the scenes, but at face value, from the patient perspective, it's quite simple, right? You get on the phone, you talk to, a doctor, you have a care team. We take an approach called medication assisted treatment. So It's a medication for treating opioid addiction specifically, which has proven to be incredibly effective, and it's considered like the gold standard of care. But not a lot of people know about it. Most people think of rehabs, which is like this model that's been it's like 50 years old. It's been around forever, but it has its pros and cons. But unfortunately, I think as we've seen with the opioid epidemic, it's been really not effective at like curtailing that. So when I lost my close friend, he was also my roommate back in college, to an overdose. Um, at the time, I felt really depressed, and I felt like it was something that I was sort of inevitable. Like, it wasn't a surprise to me or our friends that he had problems with drugs, but it was one of those things that like we didn't really know what we could do or how we could help him. Um, and it wasn't until later on, right, that I met Zach. He attended one of my classes, and unfortunately, he lost a girlfriend to a drug overdose, and in the process of that, he was actually because she was really private, she didn't want anyone else to know. He was, the only person that she ever told that she was, had this problem with drugs and she was hiding it, but needed help. And so he learned all about the space and medication assisted treatment and all these things. And it's just so hard to get access to in this country. And so, unfortunately, after she passed, the two of us met up, we shared our stories, and we started to just envision how could we use technology and like the startup model to help solve this problem, to basically expand access to this care that's like the gold standard that so many people either don't know about, or even if they do know about it, they don't know where to go. Right. Um, and so like many startup ideas, it's technology to scale access to something that's valuable and highly needed. Um, but it evolved a lot. It changed many different forms over. We officially started the business at like towards the end of 2019, um, and at the beginning of 2020, COVID happened, and that basically turned everything on its head. And as awful as that was, and especially bad from a mental health perspective, because a lot of people really struggled. Overdoses only went up. It also was this incredible opportunity for a lot of different businesses. Um, and healthcare, it was an example of that. It loosened a lot of the regulations around what was possible through telemedicine. And now, 3 years later, we now have data. We can now really prove how effective this is, and then use that to make the case that like this is the future. This is what we need to do. So we were able to expand very quickly because of that, right? Because of suddenly like people aren't going to a doctor, in person anymore. They're more and more turning to just the internet for everything, from e-commerce to medicine. And so we were able to get to like 5,000 patients, like way faster than I think we ever thought possible in the beginning. So it started small and just sort of scaled up over time. And I've learned so much about healthcare, mostly through bringing in experts and just talking to people, and consuming as much information as possible, reading books, following newsletters, watching videos, talking to experts, attending talks and stuff. And yeah, it just seems to be like the most complicated knot, um, that's like really fun to sort of unpack and start to pull apart and see it in a different way. And the problems, you know, take a long, long time to solve, but we've started to make progress in a number of areas, and I think that's really exciting.
Wow. And I mean, it started small and it's expanded, but it started sad, but
Mm.
it's also now starting to feel very hopeful, where you're getting all those data and having really convincing results. So maybe concretely, can you share how quickly did the team expand? Because I want to just put a little bit of a detail as to how quickly you guys grew.
So Zach started like pre-Ophelia. He started exploring the idea in spring of 2019. He brought on a handful of advisors, who helped point him in the right direction. Um, he reached out to me. We sort of, came up with a concrete plan, and I came on board as a co-founder. At the time, he had also already pitched uh, these two guys who became our medical directors. So actually, there's four of us sort of officially on the founding team. There's me and Zach, and then there's our two medical directors on the medical side. So sorted out with the four of us, and some advisors. The medical directors were not on board full time. They're Columbia professors and researchers, right? But they said, okay, we'll give you 5-10 hours a week, to help you develop this thing. And we actually we got into Y Combinator in the winter 2020 batch just based on the idea alone, which is quite rare. Usually you need to have built something or built traction, but I think there was something unique about this story and this approach that really appealed to them. And then coming out of that, we raised a small seed round. We just launched in Pennsylvania initially. I think by the end of that first year, 2020, we had like a few hundred patients and maybe like 200 patients, and the team was like six of us, 6 or 7. We then raised a $15 million Series A in about a year after YC. So that was spring of 2021. We used that to launch in New York, our second state, and we grew the team to maybe 20 people, 15, 20 people. So we like 2 or 3x'd over the course of that year. We then raised less than a year later, $50 million from Tiger Global. And that was actually kind of a surprise. We were not expecting that timing, and that was really fast. And obviously we worked really hard once that opportunity presented itself, but we also got really, really lucky. Especially when you look back at like everything that continued to happen over the next few months in the markets. But based on that, we grew a lot faster, as you can imagine. And I think we hired like more than 100 and it must have been more than 150 people over the course of like just over a year. We ended up at 188 was the peak, and that includes clinicians as well. Some of them are full-time, some of them are part-time. As you know, we recently did our first RIF, and that was really challenging. Last week we let go of about a third of our team, so that was about 50 people in total. And so now our team size is down, and we're closer to like 125. But yeah, it's wild to go the roller coaster from like 30 to 190 to 125, and a lot changes over that period. Of course, the business looks very different.
Yeah, and we're coming full circle to have some context about the beginning when you talked about how quickly you had to hire and expand the team, and now having to do the recent RIF, we're having numbers to be able to color that picture. So with the RIF though, how did you move through it? Because today we're chatting, and I think where you're at is clarity and excitement, and there's momentum. So what is that roller coaster like for you?
Yeah. I think the investors are often sort of the canary in the coal mine, sometimes in an annoying way. They had started to raise some questions or some concerns financially more than a year ago, or maybe about a year ago, like last February. Once the market starts to show signs of not being so solid, and investors are often the first people who are affected by that. So that's understandable. And us as founders, we didn't pay much attention to it because we kind of thought like, we don't want to get distracted here. We're also optimistic. So we're like, okay, that's, is unlikely to affect us, and we don't think it'll be that bad. So we want to stay the course, right? But over time, the market starts to change, right? And one of the things that just became obvious, the first thing we said is, all right, we hear you, and we'll of course we have to address the concerns and talk about what the different scenarios and options are. But here's our plan, and as long as we're hitting our plan and we don't deviate, like we should be fine, right? So it's not just that the market starts to change and expectations change, but also we're off from our forecasts a little bit, right? And so it's sort of the double whammy of okay, we didn't quite get to like the gross margins that we were hoping, but also now the market changed, and there's no longer really any certainty that we'll be able to raise a Series C in any reasonable amount of time based on growth alone. And it seems like overnight investors, not only stopped caring about growth, but actually growth became a bit of like a bad thing, because the more you grow, if you don't grow with profitable unit economics, you're burning more money, right? And so that becomes a liability. Um, and instead, I think, investors who are like out there start to care more about like the conservative unit economics, like gross margin, retention, things like that, right? They start to get a little bit like very cash conscious. Um, that then led towards, I think the slow realization between me and my co-founder that like, okay, under these conditions, which are very possible, that possibility starts to become more and more likely. Under these conditions, we're going to have to take some more drastic measures. And there's a whole spectrum of things you can, reduce your non-people related expenses, and then, worst case scenario, you have to consider layoffs. And then there's, big question of, well, how what's the scale of those layoffs? And we did end up doing the non-people related, budgeting. Bringing on a finance team was obviously really helpful there. We went through a whole round of budgeting iterations, which me and my co-founder had never done before ourselves. So we were not like the right people to lead it, but our VP of finance did. We as kind of was expected, we were not able to reduce costs like as much as we needed to. Right, we were able to get a little bit out there to get like more under control, but there came this moment where just like me and my co-founder had to have this hard conversation to be like, ugh, we're starting to think that layoffs need to happen, but we have no idea how to start to even approach that problem, right? It's like this ugly thing that, it's the elephant in the room, but no one wants to talk about it, and no one even knows how to talk about it.
Mm,
And that's where, going into, I think it was our December board meeting, we also just knew it was going to be a topic again, right? There's only so many times this thing can be a topic where you say, okay, well, as long as we hit this plan, we don't have to talk about that, right? So we needed to preempt this by basically coming in and saying, okay, here are some scenarios that we laid out, and we want your thoughts and your advice on which of these, you think make sense. So that's what I did. I personally, someone has to take the first pass, and so I personally, you know, one weekend I like just downloaded our entire employee roster, with titles and salaries and everything, and I just had to very crudely, and it's like it sucks. It's such a shitty feeling. Like to go through the list and basically try to decide which of these people do we need, which of them would be easy to let go of, not easy emotionally, but easy from like a business perspective. There's some people that you hire in anticipation of growth. That might be R&D, that might be different areas of the business, and in a world in which you're not expecting to grow nearly as much or at all, like that's an obvious one where it's like, okay, yeah, like it doesn't make sense to keep that person. So there's the easy list, there's the medium list, there's the hard list, and then there's the extreme list. And the
mm,
extreme list is not something I'd ever wanted to create, but our investors kind of pushed us to say, well, what would it look like to get your burn down to $1 million, a month? And I said, okay, well, I'll put that together so we can have a discussion about it, but I'm not going to like it. And in that list, it's like I laid myself off.
mm,
Our VP of finance, volunteered, and he was part of the exercise, but he's like, well, in that case, like I'll go. And we had to do that exercise so that we can more or less show the investors like, this is not a company that you want to be invested in. Like,
mm.
this is not a good company. We can do it. But that's very much cockroach mode. And it's like, we destroy a lot of the future prospects of that. So, I put together these 4 scenarios. We put that into a model that our VP of finance helped put together. We showed what the cash burn reduction looked like, how far out that extended our like cash out date. And then we had a conversation about like, or what do we think the business looks like in a year or 2 years under each one of these models? And we did that at the board level, and we got some sort of perspective from them on what they thought gave us the best shot at raising a Series C in a year and a half, what kind of company they'd be excited to invest in, how they think it worked with the new market conditions. And then Zach and I came out of that and we said, all right, we have more information. We're going to make a recommendation on which of these options, and it ended up being kind of somewhere between the medium and the hard option.
Mm,
Um, and that was only the beginning. Then we had to start to bring in like the leadership team,
mm,
because we hadn't floated any of this to them, which is, it's
mm,
challenging because it feels like I'm like we're not being transparent, but there's also a sense, transparency is a good thing, but transparency is also often very destabilizing and can be chaotic. So I'm not like
mm,
for like lying or hiding things from people, but I'm also not for communicating information before there's enough clarity to know what it means. And often when you communicate something to people, the first question they have is like, well, how is this going to affect me? Am I going to get let go? And it sucks to then be like, we don't know the answers to all these things. We're still thinking about it. So like we had to get it to the point where we knew enough information to be able to communicate to the leadership team, sort of the parameters. This is the rough scale we're talking about. This is the rough sort of sense of cash burn that we need to hit. We now need your help in actually putting together the plan. So each of them was tasked within their team of coming up with the plan of, you know, who's impacted, who's not impacted, how that affects what we're going to be able to accomplish in the next quarter and in the next year. And there's many different ways of potentially doing it, right? You have to think about maintaining processes, and for us, patient safety and knowledge of systems. Like you don't want to lose key knowledge. But we did get the whole team together, and getting buy-in is like extremely important, and also dealing with all of the emotions of this fear and anger and frustration and all of that. And you know having gone through that cycle with them, which happened in like December, and then saying, okay guys, like it's going to feel insane, but we've got 3 weeks to execute this. So here's the date that we're targeting, January 13th or something. I think we ended up with a month, but that was probably because of the holidays and some sort of complications. Generally, it doesn't help to extend something like this once it's going to happen. So you could try to, finish it as quickly as possible. But we did get their buy-in and, their involvement in the process. And honestly, from that point on, um, it sort of became this thing that moved forward on its own, right? Everyone was chipping in. Our head of people helped, put together severance agreements, and we had our legal and like everyone else, and it became easier, right?
mm,
That it wasn't just me and Zach holding the weight of this on our shoulders. We had like the whole team holding the weight of this. Um, and then obviously, the we getting through the holidays was pretty rough. We knew this was on the other side. It felt hard. There's all these complications. Like we actually didn't end up setting OKRs for Q1 because we knew it would suck to go through that whole process and then, come back 2 weeks later and be like, all right, now we have to redo that
mm,
because the teams look very different than we expected. But so we had to kind of like make up an excuse for why we didn't do OKRs. And we're like, all right, we're pushing it to January 15th, right? Just knowing all this stuff. It's really uncomfortable. But at the end of the day, I think that's what the role requires sometimes, is really being able to sit in that place of discomfort, because that's like the right thing to do. And that's how you do something like this well. I talked to a lot of people who had been through and led RIFs before. I read a lot of resources. Uh, there are a lot of best practices that are really good to follow. And then also there's a lot of areas where there's disagreement about the right way to do it. Do you tell everyone all at once over a Zoom? Do you do one-on-ones? Do you do email? Do people talk with the CEO or their direct manager? There's so many different ways. And ultimately, it was really helpful that we defined what our values were, as part of this process, and how we wanted to go about this, because that allowed us to then always refer back to like, well, is this the most kind and respectful way to do this?
mm,
And if it hits these criteria, then that's good, and like that's how we're going to do it.
mm,
And we are like, to fast forward, we're on the other side of that, and now it's really about, last week was really about like making sure everyone who was impacted was taken care of, and we're able to help them, figure out the technicalities of the severance and Cobra, and help them find jobs and set them
mm,
up with support. And this week really is about like bringing that go forward team together and really laying out, here's what the next few quarters look like. Here's
mm,
how we can address the major concerns people have. Like, everyone's thinking, am I going to have to do more work now because there's just less of us, but there's the same amount to be done? It's like, no, we're focusing, we're not expecting to do as much.
Mm,
How does this affect, all sorts of things? Uh, and I think, we have answers to those and we've communicated that, but a lot of it just comes through time and trust and seeing that,
mm.
we're doing the right things.
I think that sounds like a really well executed riff for a number of reasons. One, the most important reason is that it was authentic to you all. You listened to a lot of advice and you found what's most important to you, right? And I think that is actually the biggest thing about customizing the decisions that you're making to your unique culture. And then I hear that both you and your co-founder, you were anticipating what people may feel and what people may ask and what needs to be done, and you're staying a few steps ahead of each decision. So it's something that takes months from the start of it to making the decision, and to it probably taking a few more weeks to a month for your current team to adjust and to be able to adapt. But I also hear that you provided a lot of space for your personal feelings and for your
Yeah,
leadership team's personal feelings and emotions. And it's just a very complicated thing to do. And it won't be straightforward, but it sounds like you did it in a way that honors the people that have been working with you and honors both of you individually as leaders.
totally. Yeah, I think we took as much time as we could while still moving, at the right pace, while not like, taking too long because it was uncomfortable. I think it's good to really make sure you do it well and put as much forethought and into the detail as possible, even though inevitably something is going to get missed or we're going to overlook something. But like, I think at the end of the day, that the care and the attention to detail shows. And as you mentioned, creating space for how people are going to feel.
Yeah.
Both the impacted and the non-impacted team members will have all sorts of complicated feelings, and the goal is not to not make them feel that way, because there's no way. I think a lot of people try to like shove it under the rug or like get the team back
Right.
going, but like it is a complex process that people are going to have to go to. So
Wow.
making space for that is important.
I have a lot more new gain respect for you on how you did it. And I knew that you were going to do it in a way that was kind and respectful, but it's just an honor
Thank
to be
you.
able to hear all of the steps and all the details. Really, really beautifully done.
I
Is
appreciate
there
that.
anything that I haven't asked you yet that you really wanted to speak to?
I don't think so.
All right. Thank you so much for your time. This was so fun.
Thank you, Sabrina. I appreciate it.